So before we get into talking about any particular poem, let's talk about some key poems that you'll see in any poetry collection. There's the first poem, the last poem, the title poem, the keystone poem, and then probably I would throw in there just the strongest poems. Like, one of the questions I like to ask students is what poems are their favorites, which is really subjective, but it gets us into a conversation about where the strongest poems are in the collection, where they're located. So first, like noticing the first poem. The first poem is intended to teach the reader how to read the poetry collection. So it does a lot of work to set expectations about form, about language, about content, characters, conflict, the issues that they're dealing with, topic, things like that. So that means the first poem for the collection, but it also means the first poem for any section when poetry collections are broken up into sections. So if we're talking about the first poem in the collection, of course that does the most work. It has to be the strongest poem, and you are able to look in there and ask yourself, where does the poem take me, right? Or where will the poem take the book? Where will the poem take the section? And where does this poem in and of itself take me? When you're thinking about the last poem, you're asking, well, where did the poem leave me? And that's the last poem of the book, as well as the last poem of any sections. Where did the poem leave me? And so another question you might ask is, not only where the poem left you in terms of content, in terms of language, and how they're dealing with resolving or ending or concluding tension, but more specifically, how it resolves, ends, or concludes tension. Is it open? Is it closed? Does it refer back someplace else in the book? How does it wrap up is not the phrase I wanted to use, but I think it's better than end, because some books, there's a quote by somebody famous at some point, I don't know, let's say Robert Frost. He says that great books don't end, right? And so this is an interesting concept, especially, I don't know, it brought my attention to the way some books, instead of ending, it refers back to something that happened previously, or it will put something out of order at the end. So something from the beginning of the story will end it, or the middle of the story will end it, if there's a narrative like that. So, I mean, this is interesting to keep track of. How do stories avoid ending? How do stories remain open? And the same thing for poetry collections. When it comes to the title poem and keystone poem, not every poetry collection will have a title poem, but when it does, it draws as much attention as the first poem. The first poem is under an intense spotlight. It's the first thing you see. That's why it has to be so good. You'll, like, just thinking about the way consumers behave, they may pick up the poem in the books, the book in the bookstore, read the first one, and decide whether to buy based on that first poem. The same thing is true of the title poem. They can say, oh, the book is called this, let me flip to that poem. Maybe it's in the front, maybe it's in the middle. They'll flip to the poem and read it, and there's a heavy spotlight on that poem, so it's usually one of the strongest poems in the book, but it also has to do that same work of establishing character, establishing conflict, things like that. And what I'm calling the keystone poem is the poem that can be located anywhere in the book. It won't have a specific title, but it is a poem that, as you're reading through the collection, it does something to open up other poems for you. So you're reading it, you get to that poem and you go, oh, like there is something that poem teaches you or unveils to you that was necessary for understanding other poems that you had already experienced, and will be necessary for turning the way you see the rest of the poems in the book. So that would be the keystone poem. All of these poems are anchor poems. The only thing is the spotlight is heaviest on that first poem and the title poem, and I would also say the last poem, but it's not as strong on the keystone poem because that's a poem that has to be discovered by the reader. So those are some basic concepts so that we can talk about the first poem in the book, which I will do in the next video.